All right, if you're interested in why Hamas carried out their attack on October 7th and if Israel has any chance of fully eradicating that threat, you're going to like this interview with Colin Clarke. Now, I had some technical issues right when we got started. My microphone went out, so I'm a little bit echoey. But good news, Colin's audio is just fine, and he's the one putting out all the valuable information. Hope you enjoy. All right, what's going on, everyone? Joined today by Colin Clarke out of the Soufan Center, who focuses on domestic and transnational terrorism, international security, and geopolitics. We just started talking before hitting record about some of the information aspect coming out of the war in Gaza right now. So wanted to stop. We paused. I want to jump right back into that, Colin. Thank you for taking the time. But you were talking about how a lot of the information that Israel's putting out isn't necessarily aimed at an international audience. Could you dial in on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I did a study years ago when I was at RAND, and it was titled something along the lines of, operating, how armies operate in and through the information environment. And so we were looking really closely at exactly that, the information environment. And so I wrote a case study on Israel, and at some point the Israelis kind of reached a conclusion internally that they were very unlikely to sway international opinion one way or the other. And so their focus became domestic, like making sure that the Israeli domestic population understood the objectives of military operations and things like that. As such, they don't put nearly as much emphasis as the United States would on kind of what you might call winning hearts and minds, right? Or the kind of PR aspect of military operations in the information environment. Now, what are the reasons for that? That's an interesting study, I think, in and of itself. Why do they feel like they're unable to sway public opinion? I think they believe that there's always going to be an entrenched core of people that disagree with anything the Israelis do, and whether you want to attribute that to anti-Semitism or, people that have a anti-imperialist, decolonial mindset. I think there's a whole range of factors that kind of play in there.
They have started, from what I've seen, Israel started to put out more English language information, like English first. They had just yesterday when they went down into the hospital, they did the whole thing in English. So like that seems very focused on an international audience, or at least an American audience. But I think to your point, you mentioned earlier, there's a subset that potentially could be convinced one way or the other, but there's other groups where like it doesn't matter at this point.
Yeah, and I think that's something that the U.S. looks at differently. I don't even really like the term winning hearts and minds, but it's 2023. Everything we do is online, right? And I think the barrier to entry for mucking around in this space, for creating disinformation, we've got deep fakes, we've got cheap fakes, right? The things that you can do with an iPhone today are pretty incredible, and there's just a raft of disinformation out there. Since Elon Musk took over Twitter, or X, a lot of those safeguards and guardrails have been taken down, and so it's actually more rife with mis and disinformation today than it was even a year or two ago. But you could look online and you see videos that purport to be Gaza, and they're Syria. They're not even in the same actual part of the world. So you need a discerning eye. I think generally, in the U.S. we lack digital literacy, and the further, I don't mean this to be an ageist comment, but in general, right, the older generations are, the less they are digital natives, and so maybe more prone to believe things that they see on the internet, right? But it's really just a total minefield when you're trying to navigate this, even as a researcher, right? I have to stop and pause sometimes when I see something and say, is that real? Is that really what I think it is? And even doing digital forensics, it's not always apparent, right? And so there's firms that specialize just in that. There's a place called TruePic that Munir Ibrahim is one of the creators of, and that's pretty much what they do, is they try to discern, images that are real from images that are fake. But it takes a lot of time, and frankly, by the time someone sees something, it's already made an impression on them, right? Literature on behavioral psychology shows why first impressions are so important, because you could then be corrected days or weeks later, but your brain still thinks about it in a certain way.
It's crazy. But to take it back to the start here, to be interested in your thoughts on what Hamas was trying to achieve when they went into Israel on October 7th. I feel like this is something that's still debated. What were they after? Like, what was the goal of that attack on the 7th, do you think?
I think that's something that maybe we won't know. There was a really good piece by Joby Wark in the Washington Post that came out on Sunday that said the goal was, based on interviews with captured militants, based on some of the pocket litter or documents found on dead Hamas fighters, that the goal was to provoke a significant overreaction, right? To get the Israelis to come in, really drop the hammer, kill a lot of civilians, and then, to what end? I'm not really sure. I think it would be difficult to ascribe one motive to what occurred, because even though Hamas was leading the charge, you had other groups playing a role like Palestinian Islamic Jihad. You had other just regular kind of, what people have called the Shabiha, or kind of thugs, criminals that got into the mix that were outside of the Hamas chain of command and control, that allegedly kidnapped some victims, that kind of went off script a little bit. And if you look at the brutality of the attack, I have to think at a very visceral, element, there was some revenge factored in there. I mean, a lot of the talking points about Hamas's ISIS are bunk. There's a lot of differences. In fact, there's far more differences between Hamas and ISIS than there are similarities. But the savagery of the attack itself and the brutality is accurate, right? Like, that is on par with something that ISIS would do. I think Hamas didn't do themselves any favors by going that far, by targeting civilians instead of military. There's some real blowback there. But what's the goal, at the end of the day? Some people have speculated it was to ruin normalization, right? The normalization talks that were apparently imminent between Israel and the Saudis. That could have been Iran's motive for training, equipping, financing, Hamas. But what was the, thought process within the higher ranking echelon of those who launched this operation? Anybody's guess. Maybe it's just what Hamas says in its charter, which is to destroy Israel. Maybe it's that simple, but I suspect it's multifactorial.
Yeah, and the desire to do that is one thing. Like, of course, Hamas, if they had the ability to do this, would do this on multiple occasions. It's more just this was clearly built up and planned for. It wasn't just like a let's go. So it seems like there had to have been some driving factor there, but it does
planning.
Yeah, it does seem like more and more, from my perspective, that Hezbollah did not know. I think Nasrallah came out and even said it was, whether or not we're taking that at face value, that they weren't aware of the planning. It doesn't seem like we've heard a lot recently about Iran's involvement beyond just their traditional equipping and financing. Have you heard any more on that front, their connections with the actual planning of the attack?
So my sense is that the Iranians didn't order this, right? They don't micromanage their proxies in that way, but they give them all the tools that they need to be able to conduct, this kind of attack. The fact that Hezbollah and Iran didn't jump in the fray immediately shows you that they probably weren't prepared for this. And maybe the Iranians even bit off more than they can chew. When two carrier strike groups show up in your neighborhood, even the most bellicose, fiery rhetoric tends to tamp down a little bit. I think the Iranians, don't necessarily want a conflict with the United States, but at the same time, they need to kind of they need to front for the axis of resistance. They don't want to back down rhetorically, but this is the classic Iranian playbook. And we wrote a report at the Soufan Center, back in 2019 that laid out a lot of this. Right, the Iranians like to go right up to the line without crossing it. They do this in multiple ways. They do this through the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, the IRGC-QF, which was previously commanded by Qasem Soleimani before he was ceremoniously taken off the battlefield early 2020 during the Trump administration on a visit to Iraq. And that plays into a bunch of this, that the Iranians are hell-bent on showing that they're not deterred. But that's a lot of military hardware to bring into the region, and I think the Iranians did get the signal. All that said, they've got a lot of different pressure points and a lot of ways that they can play this. Their strategy is almost like death by 1,000 paper cuts. They've got the Houthi militias, the Houthi rebels in Yemen. They've got Iraqi Shia militia in Iraq. that can pop off. They've got assets in Syria, Lebanon, really throughout the region. The problem becomes one minor miscalculation could then spiral out of control, and all sides could end up in a conflict that most in actuality really don't want. But there's face saving that goes along with this too, right? I mean, it brings me back to some of Tom Schelling's old work and stuff that Bob Jervis has done on perception and misperception. This is international relations. These things happen.
It's you said something that drives me up the wall here. Just as a human being, nobody wants this war. Like, you see, Iran and the United States do not want direct war with each other, but here we are every single day talking about little things that we're each doing that could lead to that.
100%. And that's a real possibility. I mean, we could look, the United States is withdrawn from Afghanistan, is drawn down to close to, 2,500 troops in Iraq, maybe 900 in Syria. The U.S. largely wants to remove its military forces from the region. Doesn't want a ground war in Iran. I mean, that would destroy the region even further. That would tank the global economy. I don't think, what's the objective there? I don't think the U.S. is or should be in the business of regime change. Also doesn't work very well. Can you point to an example where we've done that and it's actually worked out well? I can't. Iraq, Libya, you can go down the list. At the same time, the U.S. doesn't want to acquiesce to the Iranians' goal of completely having its presence removed from the region, right? Like, so there's a fine line there between not wanting to overcommit, but also being quite measured and being resolute and keeping the forces we have where they are. I mean, we have military bases throughout the region. We've got a presence in Syria and Iraq to limit the Islamic State, and so without a U.S. presence in the region, the power vacuum could lead to, more dangerous situations. It also opens the door for some U.S. adversaries to flex their muscles, the Russians and the Chinese at the top of that list.
Speaking of that, in terms of Islamic State, Al Qaeda, or any other of these more transnational groups, have you seen much from them in terms of trying to leverage this situation or at least use it for propaganda purposes to date?
Yeah, I mean, all across the board. I had a piece in the LA Times talking about the reaction of some of the Al Qaeda linked groups, and they're very opportunistic. They're piling on. ISIS is a bit of a different animal, and I've got a piece with Lucas Weber that should be coming out for the Irregular Warfare Institute next week sometime, where we talk about ISIS's reaction. Also opportunistic, but not really lauding Hamas, because there's a lot of bad blood between those groups. ISIS looks at Hamas and sees a group that sat for elections, right, which ISIS is totally against. ISIS looks at Hamas and sees a group that receives support from a Shia state in Iran, totally against that, right? Even the Shia are actually more hated by ISIS than the Americans are. So that's, completely, they're a takfirist group, right? They're constantly canceling people and excommunicating them. It's the original cancel culture group of jihadis, right? And so, they don't really have any love for Hamas. At the same time, right? Let's go back to the old trope, and it's fairly hackneyed and well worn, but still true to some respect. In the Middle East, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So they see the Israelis being attacked, and well, it is Hamas and they're apostates, but okay, we'll take it. Moreover, what they're going to do is try to leverage that, right? They're going to try to leverage the groundswell of anger at Israel when we look at all these kind of civilian casualties and collateral damage, these images coming out in the Arab and Muslim world, and they're going to try to leverage that to achieve their own ends and push people to commit lone actor attacks in the West, in Europe, and the United States to the extent that they can.
Is that statement, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, does that help describe the relationship between Hamas and Iran? Because we spent all this time in Iraq understanding how Sunni and Shia, the divide there, they were openly fighting each other. So we kind of looked at the Middle East with that lens. And now all of a sudden we've got a war where a Shia state is backing a Sunni group. Is it as simple as enemy of my enemy?
It's a bit more complicated than that. I mean, we could go throughout. I had a piece for the Foreign Policy Research Institute where I kind of traced the evolution of the relationship, because at a certain point, Hamas has a falling out with the Syrian government. At the beginning of that civil war there, Hamas kind of sides with some of the Sunni groups that are fighting against the Assad regime. And the Syrians had long been a conduit for Iranian support, two Palestinian groups. I'd say, if anything, what it should teach us as analysts is that we can't just rely on heuristics and quote unquote conventional wisdom, right? Sectarianism is a huge issue in the Middle East, but it doesn't define every single relationship. And so, when you tell someone, well, Hamas works with Iran, they'll say, what do you mean? But that's a Sunni group in a Shia country. Right. And, the world is complicated and complex. I think there's clear ideological differences, but they are partnering together. They have for some time. And it's a mutually beneficial relationship, right? Does it mean it will last forever? Absolutely not. I also think it's interesting to ponder, what if sectarianism becomes less of a driving force in the region over time? What groups are well positioned to take advantage of that? And if you look at the way that kind of ISIS used sectarianism as a real cornerstone of its recruitment, I think it gives an edge to Al Qaeda, which wasn't nearly as as takfirist as the Islamic State. If there is more collaboration or cooperation between Sunni Shia in the region, and remember, Al Qaeda spent a lot of time, in Iran. I mean, much of it under house arrest, but there is some kind of a precedent for a relationship there. I had a long piece with Osman Yarmir in Lawfare a few years back, kind of laying a lot of this out. AQ could very well benefit from a decrease in sectarianism in the region. Will we get there? It's hard to say. But if you look at the Abraham Accords, I mean, you have longstanding foes of Israel, including the Saudis, now making peace or agreeing to kind of, hey, let's make money together. So there's a lot of, politics makes for strange bedfellows. I think that statement is never more true than in the Middle East, right? We can't always just rely on what we think we know. There's just a lot of, strange things that happen, realignments that take place.
The new emir of Al Qaeda, or the supposed emir, Saif al-Adil, isn't he recently, like, he was in Iran for like a decade or something, wasn't he?
Exactly. Yeah. So, and I, so there's a lot of relationships. Bin Laden's son had spent time there. All sorts of high-ranking members of Al Qaeda. So, and again, I don't think it's necessarily a chummy relationship, but there is a relationship.
So it's 2023, and we're talking about Al Qaeda. 22 years after the 9/11 attacks, Israel's been talking about eradicating Hamas.
Yeah.
Is that, when you hear that, do you think that's realistic, or is that, you can't say we're going to severely degrade until they can't hit us again? Is it feasible?
No, in a word. The United States wanted to eradicate ISIS. Now we're talking about, and this is no disrespect to the Israelis, again, that's one of the most formidable militaries in the world. But the United States led a coalition of, I think, 84 nations, right? The global coalition to defeat Daesh. And last time I checked, ISIS is still around.
Arguably
now,
bigger than they were in 14, right? With the number of branches.
If you look at the branches, yeah, but even in the Levant, right, even in Iraq and Syria, they still maintain a presence. It's incredibly difficult. I can't remember the last time a terrorist or insurgent group was eradicated. If someone can point me to an example, I'd love to see it. The other part of that is, what's the trade-off? What are the costs that you need to bear in order to get to that, to get to that objective? Even if we thought it was feasible, what would the Israelis have to do? How many, civilians would have to die in the process to go and actually eradicate every last Hamas member? In reality, and, I'm never one to quote Don Rumsfeld, so don't get it twisted, but, how many more terrorists are we creating in the process, right? To paraphrase, in this pursuit of hunting down every last Hamas member, how many kids in the new generation that just witnessed, wanton destruction in Gaza are going to then commit themselves to joining Hamas 2.0? I think that's a fair question to ask.
Good point. Well, I know you're a busy man, Colin. I really appreciate you taking the time. But any closing thoughts as we wrap up here?
I just think, I hear a lot of focus, and understandably so, from the Israelis on the military aspects of this conflict. I'd like to hear some thoughtful comments or see some analysis on what next. When the conflict ends and winds down, which it inevitably will, as all conflicts do, what's the political plan to make sure that we're not back in this situation in 6 months? Is there a Palestinian state that would be acceptable to the Israelis? Is the two-state solution completely dead? Who governs that state? There's so many questions about the political aspect that I have that I'd love to start seeing some answers to. And I think, there probably are some really smart people thinking about this. But I think we need to begin thinking a little bit more and talking and debating about what the contours of a political settlement look like, one that's acceptable potentially to both sides. Who are the trusted interlocutors that are able to make that happen? Because if we, go back to the status quo, I don't see anything that's changing the dynamics that doesn't bring us back to this same place somewhere down the road.
Like, yeah, hopefully we start to see more on that front. But I'll link where you can find Colin and all of his work in the description below. Thank you so much, sir. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.